presentation of this, don't fall asleep on me. The format of the presentation of this material is based on the idea that kids, that when we grew up, those of us who are over 75 elders, baby boomers 55 to 75, Generation Xers 35 to 55, millennials 20 to 35, or the people who are under that, which is the generation we're primarily studying, Gen Z, live in different worlds.
Why do they refer to it as postmodern?
Postmodern?
Yeah.
Because the mythos of the modern world grows out of the Industrial Revolution and is science-based, with the idea that through science and modern living we can solve all of humanity's problems. And postmodern thinking began with the deconstructionist thinking of the 1920s, a century ago, that we discovered after World War I that human beings were not on a liberal progressive movement forward to perfection, but that there's this annoying thing called human sin that keeps getting involved and keeps wrecking the flow. And so the beginning of deconstructing all of our meta-narratives, all our myths, all of our stories about how we lived, we talked about last week some, began in that time frame. And we were still identifying ourselves as on this kind of progressive upward trend until about the Vietnam War, and then you began to hear the phrase postmodern, that people just didn't buy it anymore. People didn't buy the myth that the American dream was going to work for everybody and you just work hard and go to school. The structure began to fail. So postmodern identifies a time when we're looking for new ways to organize our thinking other than around the idea that, the ideas we looked at as a part of the wind down or the tick up, if you prefer, that got us to the crisis point of 9/11 and the radical changing of the culture.
How far would you say we are into the great resurgence of this time?
We are in the figuring it out period.
Okay.
We're in the first 100 years, and we are within the first 10 or 15 years of that first 100 years. We are necessarily the ones who are building the elements for what will be identified as the who's in charge, or where do you go for information, or what now is our authority? Remember those questions from last week?
What's working?
Who's calling the shots, or where do you go for authority? We're the ones who are beginning to put that together and understand that in a new cultural format built around all of this information, a kid having an encyclopedia in their pocket, kind of a world. So that's kind of the foundation. So we're just at the beginning of it, and none of us will be around to see where it stabilizes. We're kind of at the point of Luther tacking the 95 Thesis on the door and just beginning to hear the excitement of it. So
The woman that was in the video last week, is that the end of her, or is she going to be along some more?
no, I think that's the end. That's the end for her in terms of what we're doing here. We're going to have different presenters this week and different presenters next week. I do have the full video series and the workbooks that go with it. And with the introduction we had last week, you might be able to do that class. I gave it to our Halo group, and it was a little bit, in terms of the actual structure, it was a little overwhelming. They couldn't quite figure it out from what she was doing. And it was unfair. As I look back on what I thought I was giving them was the basic book and her doing little lectures that would help explain what was going on in the basic book, not the opening lecture being about chapter 1 and 3 and not mentioning chapter 2 stuff at all, and then jumping to chapter 5 and back and forth. The dialogue in the videos is a little more confusing, but once we've read the book and once you've done what we did last week, you could probably watch that whole series and get something out of it. So
She was so insightful. So
She's a
really-
sharp cookie.
And she used, between the garage sale thing and a couple of different things, she just hit the spot with her.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, and this is gonna be, hang on for David Kinnaman and the research from Barney Institute. We're
The
gonna
phrase
do-
post-truth is a tidy encapsulation of our current cultural moment, especially now in the screen age. It's so easy for the things that we read and the things that we see to routinely deceive us. The Russians understood this in 2016, maybe better than we understood it ourselves. And for leaders today, for communicators, for persuaders, for parents, I think it's more complicated than ever. These are a few of the different issues that we think are making leadership more complicated, some of the post-truth trends that we're tracking. And we're gonna have to learn a whole new set of tools and techniques and ways of thinking as leaders and communicators in this new reality. One of the things that we're finding in the research is that a majority of people now are turning inward to find truth. We ask people this question: whatever is right for your life or works best for you is the only truth you can know. We asked an agree, disagree way. And we found that a majority of adults, 3 out of 4 millennials, and 2 out of 5 practicing Christians agreed with this. See, we work so hard as community to curry trust, but people aren't really looking whether they trust or mistrust you. They want to know whether this confirms and corresponds to the things that they already think are true. Another trend that we're seeing is the fact that people are increasingly overconfident in the things that they believe, the things that their own expertise and experience. We asked this question: who are you most likely to see as a credible news source? Actually, the full results are in your Q book, the page after my picture, I think. But one of the most common responses was that nobody. I trust my own instincts. I mean, 1 in 3 people say that's their most credible news source, or their tribe, their family, and their peers and their friends. So this thing about overconfidence is really interesting. What we're seeing in the research, there's this growing body of research now that shows that when you have a little information, it can actually make you overconfident. We see this all the time in our research about the Bible, for example. When people know a little bit about the Bible, they way overestimate their knowledge and expertise with the scriptures. People who visit, love it, yeah, preach, I will. When we find this is affecting doctors, that people come in now more and more to the doctor's office already having self-diagnosed. And so we're living in this interesting post-truth reality. All of us are trying to work with a different kind of environment. And so the third thing I want to mention to you is that people are increasingly insulated in their digital tribes, right? So we asked this question: which groups do you think it would be difficult for you to have a natural and normal conversation with? And when we show you these Muslims, Mormons, atheists, evangelicals, LGBT community, these all represent a minority, a small percentage of the total population. So we're asking all adults, who do you think it would be difficult for you to have a normal and natural conversation with? And you can see the most common was with Muslims. 73% of Americans say don't know how to talk to Muslims. 60% say they don't know how to talk to Mormons. 56% would have a difficult time having a conversation with an atheist. 55% with evangelicals. 52% with LGBT community. What's interesting is that our conversational structure, we're more social, but we're more disconnected in many ways. And we can slice the data by looking just at evangelicals. So check this out. Here's the percentage of evangelicals, and what they say would be hard for them to have a natural and normal conversation. 87% with Muslims. A majority. The numbers are higher. I mean, this hurts my heart as a Christian, as an evangelical, because shouldn't we at least think we're good at this? I just want you to know that 1/4 of evangelicals think they'd have a difficult time having a natural and normal conversation with an evangelical. Guilty, right?
We can't even talk to ourselves.
All right, so this is changing. What will we do as leaders in this new environment? And it's getting more difficult for us as leaders and persuaders, even as parents, to do this work. I mean, the tools that we usually use of trying to be really, really earnest, of really, really saying something that means something, it makes you look like Michael Scott from The Office. And a lot of pastors and leaders are now saying, man, the tools that I use to try to convince people of things, they don't seem to be working in the same way. I have a colleague in the research industry who's doing a focus group for the soft drink industry, and just a secular researcher, and she said that she was running a focus group, and she was asking the group members, okay, what should we name this new line of drinks? And the top rated suggestion back from the focus group was diabetes. It's like, guys, that's not, we gotta think outside the box here, right? In one of the exit interviews that we did with a young person who left the church, we asked, what about the youth pastor? What are the reasons that you maybe left? And what about your relationship with that youth pastor? You know, did you think that that person was a friend? Did they have your best interest in mind? And this young woman said, that person is paid to be my friend. It's just part of her job description. So this is part of what's challenging, is how do we break through the suspicion, the sense of like, I already know what's going on here, I get it. How do we break through this? I have three suggestions. One is that we need to learn to voice people's questions and experiences. We need to be better listeners. Bobette did a great talk on that a few minutes ago. How can we as leaders not just understand people's thinking and their sort of their demographics, but how can we understand what they're feeling and what they're experiencing? Research it's limited, but it's one of the most important tools we need to have today to really understand how we can get outside of our own limited frame of reference as communicators, as leaders, as pastors, as organizational leaders, even as parents, as neighbors. How do we really learn to listen to others? That's so important. The second thing is, based on this understanding, not just based on what you want to communicate, but based on what we learn about what people are really feeling, would there be a way for us to connect people to a compelling vision of truth? So, from doctors, some of the doctors I know, I was asking them some questions about this, and they said, what I have to do now is say, hey, the things that you came into my office that you think you knew about this disease, you're not even really monitoring things the correct way, the way you've already self-diagnosed, the overconfidence you have about this. I can't say all those things. I just have to say, that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
I have to give them a different way to understand their experience. Maybe we move from saying, the Bible says this, so you just have to trust it, to, let me help you understand how the Bible can interpret and help you understand and explain what you're experiencing, what you're feeling. How Ecclesiastes speaks to an ambitious age, how the wisdom literature helps us deal with many, many issues, how the scriptures help us understand who we are as humans, and most importantly, understand a compelling vision of truth in Christ. And then finally, we have to live it and be consistent. This is maybe one of the most difficult parts for this, but I'm just, as I see the research, as we look at some of the challenges that are coming up with millennials and Gen Z, the issues that they face, who in your life, who will you sort of hear from that helps you make sense of how to be consistent and coherent in your leadership? A few years ago, my oldest, she's now 18, so this was many years ago, but I had gone to church earlier than usual on a Sunday morning to teach one of the Sunday school classes, and she got up and was talking to my wife, Jill, which is my daughter, Emily, and I was not usually gone on Sunday morning, so she said to Jill, where's Dad this morning? And she said, well, he's teaching the adults about Jesus. And she looked quizzically at my wife and said, he doesn't really know that much about Jesus, does he? You gotta live it. It caused me to think a little bit about what we might talk about at home in different ways. Listen, what I'm asking you to consider, just from a stat guy, a nerd for Christ's sake here, is there a way for you to relearn, not to rely on power and prestige, your expertise, the things that you know really well? Are there ways for us to learn to do a different way of communicating today? Can we learn to lean in to people's experience and really listen to what our culture is saying, to what our neighbors are saying? Can we give them a compelling vision of truth, especially now in a post-truth society? Thanks.
You really want to feel out of position. This We Take the Gen Z quiz featuring Anna Akana, who's a very popular millennial podcast star, and she's been in some movies and TV shows. Anyway, these guys are all in their mid-20s through early 30s, and they do a quiz on the things that are current relevant for Gen Zers. And the Gen Zers, the stars, the symbols that the apps that they go to on their phones, and the symbols they use for various things, already the 20 to 35-year-olds didn't have a clue. They were getting the answer wrong most of the time as to what was going on and relevant
Already behind the
for
curve.
the under 20s. Yep, already behind the curve. So that says something about how challenging things are, and so I hope that you will enjoy. Come on, fingers.
At what point are we gonna have discussion on this, Pastor?
Well, let's talk now while we're waiting for the next thing to fire up.
I was just thinking that, we've, maybe this, the fact that people rely on their own instincts for truth,
Mhm.
we for years, I have been known to say to people, perception is reality. So basically, we've kind of invited that ourselves because we basically said to people, however you see it is your reality. So basically, if you perceive something to be true, then what we're saying to them is that it to you is true. And so that means that truth is
We've created a relativized.
relative to a person's perception, and that's,
Is that so bad?
well, apparently if we're looking for absolute truth, so.
The answer is, how do we help people? Remember, we said kids today do not buy mega narratives anymore. They just don't buy them, and they want to hear the stories. They're more interested, rather than Moses parting the waters and the 7 days of creation and the end of the world with Revelation. They don't care. Those are mega stuff. They want to go to a meta narrative with a big storyline. They'll go to Marvel Comics. They'll go to Star Wars. They'll go to Lord of the Rings. They'll go to Star Trek. They'll go to Guardians of the Galaxy. They'll find all the really cool, big, expansive, universal, global storylines with quote universal truths in them. What they're more interested in is the stories where Jesus is healing one person. They want to know. And that was part of what he was saying, is you don't talk to them in terms of generics anymore. It's let me talk to you about how the book of Ecclesiastes could be relevant to your life in this current postmodern world you're living in. So we have to take the truth and bring it to a level where it impacts their life.
But let me politicize this. A person's perception, I picked a person. A person's perception that this particular class of people are bad. I mean, if that's their perception, then what we're saying to them is, well, that's perception's reality for you. And so that to me really is kind of a circular problem.
It's kind of scary.
Yeah. Because what you're kind of validating that perception by saying to them, well, the way you see it is obviously your reality, and it's kind of a backing off of judgment. You're backing off of judging the validity or the truth of what they're saying.
Right. What I'm saying is different. What I'm saying is that we have to introduce them to larger truths in smaller pieces, in more relational ways and in smaller pieces. And it's sort of like we talked about belonging for the next generation. The first they walk through the door, and as far as you're concerned, you belong the minute you walk through the door. And as you build networks in the community, you start to behave more like, you start to do service projects, you start to do things for others. And then at some point you say, well, now I'd like to go to one of our Wednesday morning classes and learn more about what the Bible says. And, now I want to know the bigger story. But we can't start with the bigger story anymore. People just don't buy it.
Yeah.
The other thing that's important in this, I'll use a quick phrase, and then I want to get on to the data for Gen Zers. We misuse the word relative when we say everything is relative. Relativity has nothing to do with saying everything's of equal value. Relativity, the theory of relativity says this point and this point interact. And if I move this point, it's going to have an impact on this point. Relativity has to do with the connections and associations between literally every atom on the planet, every electron and molecule on the planet, all the way up through people. Everything we do has an impact in such a way that we are related. And that's not bad, because we have a God who is a relational God, a God who says, I'm willing to empty myself out and come down and live amongst you and walk with you, because it's the only way I can teach you how I, as the creator of this universe, want to have a personal relationship with you and help you to understand that in our relationship, your relationship with every other person and the planet and everything you do matters. But it all has to do with, that's what relational, that's what relative or relational means. And we need to get to that point, because, and a big part of that he's pointing out relates to all the conversation stuff we've been doing too, and that is, boy, we gotta learn to really listen, because people, you are correct. One of the things he's saying is, if you watch Fox News, you're gonna have one view of the world through the way that they pick the stories that their editorial board picks, the way their writers write the stories, and the way that their people present them. And if you listen to MSNBC, you're going to get exactly the opposite. Carlene and I go back and forth, and we see the same event happens, and we watch it on two different events. These people are screaming and yelling about things from one, and I mean screaming and yelling, and calling names, and disregarding, and devaluing people, and calling the people idiots. And these people are upset and arguing almost as vociferously, or and sometimes more so at Fox. But I mean, Rachel Maddow goes crazy. Joe Scarborough goes crazy. Some of the guys at Fox, foaming, Sean Hannity can be foaming at the mouth. But and if you listen to one or the other, you're gonna interpret the facts when they come out.
Well, and it's interesting.
Through that world.
It's interesting, and I have to admit that I'm on the liberal side of things, but it's interesting the way the news is presented, what they call the news is presented, because they were talking about these children being aggregated in this environment, and they use the term, they're behind a chain link fence, just like we keep dogs behind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really a necessary part of the story.
Notice the modifier, the use of adjectives and modifiers to hook your feelings.
Yeah,
on both sides.
Oh yeah, I'm not, because it just, when I heard that, it right away triggered, obviously people's concept of chain link fence is that it's a negative thing, it's an imprisonment kind of issue, and when they said just like they keep dogs behind, obviously they're saying that they're treating them as less than humans.
You know how many segments of a typical industrial foundry and factory have tons of chain link fence to segregate areas?
Yeah.
So that things don't get mixed up or moved into or put in dangerous places. It's all over the place. Yeah, the use of that modifier to change it. And yesterday we had two, I would say, aggressive, one even almost violent reaction to that event as it's going on in our culture, with people going ballistic and name calling, and so it is. We are in a ramp up period. So listening is going to be hard when we recognize that. So we're going to need to listen. We're going to be working today at listening to this unique group of kids. I'm going to try to do about 2/3 of this material. This that I handed you is actually the 4th section of the book. And so hopefully you can go back and reread this after we've given you the data from the first couple sections. The format is that kids, you and I grew up in Jerusalem. We grew up in a place where the church was central, or the temple was central. It's kind of an analogy, but church was central. People had pretty much the same value system. People had the same rules for how you behaved. If I misbehaved at the Impin's house, Mrs. Impin could swap me on the fanny, and if I went crying home, my mom would say you deserved it. There was a sense in which the culture as a whole held together. Today, Mrs. Impins wouldn't do that. she would just quietly find a way to make sure I never came back to her house again, isolate the kids, isolate her kids, and no parent would agree with another parent on how to discipline their children. We live in a different world. These kids are growing up in what the book calls Babylon. It's no longer, we are in a post-Christian, post-truth. We just talked about post-truth. There is no clear single truth. People are getting their sources from different places, and their truths, their way of interpreting the data is fundamentally different. So we are living in a world with a variety of truths, a variety of ways of looking at things. So to have a conversation, as he pointed out in the video, evangelicals, 25% of them say, I have trouble talking to other evangelicals about my faith, let alone Muslims and Mormons and
On the other hand, how would you know if you if you've never been together with a bunch of Mormons? How would you, or Muslims, I should say? How would you?
well, that's why they're afraid to talk. But they're saying not only that, they can't even talk to each other was the point, because they're not sure where they're going to stand. So this issue of listening becomes important. At a glance, Generation Z, those under the age of 19, and they were only able to get tracing statistics for legal reasons and sociological reasons. Kids under 13 are not reliable to interview. And there's a lot that they did to level this off between generations so they could see things that are trends and not just things that have to do with the fact that these guys are young. In point of fact, they are just like we were, trying to figure out how to deal with all the raging hormones in their bodies, trying to figure out how to date and who to date,
How to
belong. All of that stuff is happening for them. And so they try to factor in for those issues and yet say, what's unique about this generation? What are we seeing coming up? And there are some trends, and there are going to be some things where we can say, well, I can see that, and maybe they'll grow out of it. And we can certainly talk about those as they come on. 13 to 18-year-olds are twice as likely as adults to say they are atheists. That was not true 20 years ago, 40 years ago, or 60 years ago. When we were teens, we might have had some questions about our faith, but we would not have said we're an atheist, unless you just wanted to be ornery. Twice as many are willing to say they're atheists. Only 3 in 5 identify as Christian, compared to 2/3 of adults. So it's gone from 67 or 70% down to below 60, actually, a little below 60 now. About half of Gen Z is non-white. These kids are growing up in a world with more Orientals, more Hispanics, more blacks, more mixed cultural background friends. They are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in American history. We're a post-white society. That has an effect on our value system. Half say happiness is their ultimate goal in life. They're pursuing happiness. And we're going to find out what that means. And that is unique to this generation.
What was it before?
Finding out we're going to learn about that as we go through the slides. Finding out about yourself is much more important than the previous generation. What does happiness entail? We're going to find out for 43% of Gen Z, financial happiness equals financial success as their absolute highest priority in life. More than half of teens use screen media. 57% of these kids use their devices at least 4 hours a day. And if you go down to 2 hours a day, it's like 80% of them. And there is about 25 or so 25% use it 8 hours a day or more. And I would be one of those kids. I'm not 119, but I am. 1/3 report being bullied on the internet. So that's just a quick overview of, and now we're going to get into the actual data for this first section. Any comments as I hit the first slide?
No, except I can't read any of that.
I know this, and I tried 18 different ways to make this visible. The themes we're going to be looking at are technology, worldview, identity, security, diversity, and the role of parents. Those are going to be the topics that we're that are going to kind of organize our thinking. In the area of technology, we just said 57% of them are on their devices at least 4 hours a day. That's outside of school. That's not counting what they do when they're in school. Only 4% of this generation, which is dramatically different, believe in the idea that God created. If you want to say God created the world in 7 days, and you say, and you don't even have to believe that a day is 24-hour period. You could say it's a period of time, but this is the way and the order in which God unraveled the universe, and God did it. Only 4% of the kids under 20 believe that.
Oh, that's almost nothing.
Almost nothing. In terms of identity, 33% say that gender is what you feel inside. So, and it's going to be more specific than that as we get into the details. But their identity is in flux and fluid, and I'm going to use that word again later. Their sense of security is built around one thing, which is money. You got to remember, this generation was born, has grown into consciousness since 2008 when the entire economy collapsed. So they've grown up in a collapsed economy world. Many of them, more than half of the kids in this generation growing up are in single-parent mom families where mom's working at least two part-time jobs in this slow economy since 2008, and they are struggling. You remember, we have 48 million people on or 47 million people on food stamps, more than 10% of our culture on food stamps, almost 15%. And of those 15%, the vast majority of them are kids. So these guys, their idea of security is simply the buck. Not faith in God, not community. Their mom is, too busy to take them to church. They don't have their extended family around them. Their sense of family may be very confused in the sense that their dad is out of the picture. Their sister or brother's dad is out of the picture. The man that mom's living with right now is not married to mom, but wants me to call him dad, and I ain't going to call that idiot dad. I don't know who he is. Okay, so their structure is different in terms of family. So their only sense of security is the buck. Diversity, these guys, most of them, 39% have one of their best friends is of a different race. Okay, now it's not so true in the UP, a little hard to have it happen in a homogeneous area like this, but across the country, the vast majority of kids have a friend who is Hispanic or black or...
Unless you count Swedes and Finns.
Yeah, that's true. But that's all Scandinavian. You go to the DNA charts from whatever, Ancestry.com, they just call that Scandinavian.
That was my feeble attempt at humor, so
Yeah,
sorry about that.
I got it. I was being honest. Parents are still their primary role model. 56% of these kids want to look to their parents as their role model, and so they're looking for that support for identity. But this is where their security lies. I think that's fascinating. Here's the picture of actual screen time. Not only is it an issue of lack of sleep, but it's affecting their attention span, their brain function, and the way your brain is, we're discovering that the brain is being wired differently because of these devices, because of the way we utilize them, the way our neurons are connecting is functioning differently. How do they use it? They're so used to this stuff, they don't even think about it. This is more than any other generation. This is where they meet people, is online. They love to follow their celebrities and their favorite brands and stuff online. They use it less than the rest of adults for finding about when things happen. Adults here will use Facebook or use the First Lutheran webpage, mostly to look at the calendar or to get the newsletter online or in some manner to find information. They could care less about that. And looking for news stories, they do less of that than everybody else. Otherwise, talking and chatting with friends, sharing photos and videos, connecting with or meeting new people, all of that, that's just where they do it. The big switches here they're about the same in terms of is TV news trustworthy? You know, the local news tells you about what's going on, that's pretty trustworthy. National newspapers, and we don't trust those quite as much as the rest of the adults in the world, but they're not too bad. But significantly, online news content is significantly higher, and social media, using Facebook to get news, is way higher than all other adults. So they're trusting sources of information which are crowdsourcing. And social media, we're discovering, is very manipulated, isn't it? Google has filters and decides what's going to go and what's not going to go. And they will look for words they have computers that watch for the word content of this lecture. They could take me down if they don't like what I say. They'll have a computer analyze what I say in this session with y'all, and if they don't like it, I'm down. Here's an interesting one I thought, and I'm sorry I had to put this on sideways to get it to fit the slide. Looking at other people's posts on Facebook, on Snapchat, on Instagram, on texting, looking at other people's posts often makes me feel bad about the way I look. Self-image. 31% for the kids, 30% for the millennials, and I might just use the phrase 20 to 35-year-olds so we don't get confused. 20% for those under the age of 35 to 55, and baby boomers, anybody over 55, they don't care. But for this younger generation, look at how they're beginning to form their identity around what they see on their devices. Looking at other people's posts often makes me feel bad about the lack of excitement in my own life. Well, what do you take pictures of? Do you take pictures of sitting in your chair, watching TV? What do you take pictures of?
Usually when you're on vacation.
On vacation or doing something cool.
Yeah.
And so if you're sitting home watching your friends out doing cool things, it really affects there's a high level of depression and suicide in this generation. Dramatically, suicide's double what it is, even in the 20 to 35-year-olds. There's a high level of suicide and high level of depression because look at how much fun they're having, and I'm sitting home watching it on a stupid device because I'm sitting home playing video games. I got no friends. That's dramatic. 39, 34, 24, and baby boomers over the age of 55, we could care less. You know? I have experienced bullying on social media. Again, look at the range. Even as a baby boomer, I got an email the other day from somebody who said, I'm very bad English, I am in India, I've been on the internet, I've seen a picture of you doing, and I won't say what it was, but some bizarre thing, and it was sent out to pastors, and it was basically saying, aha, pastor, I caught you doing something that's a sexual act that if your congregation knew about it, you would lose your job. Pay me money and I won't do it. I won't. So what are they doing? That's bullying or extortion on the internet. Yeah, it's out there for everybody, but these kids particularly experience bullying. Most important thing as they look at life, and this leads us into the next section a little bit, most important thing that they see as having the center of their identity, the highest priority thing for these kids is money. Second highest is getting an education so that they can get
More money.
money.
That was my question, yeah, where did education, at least they're thinking it's important.
Yeah, but these guys are not going to be these guys are not going to liberal arts colleges. These guys are going to schools where they're going to learn a technical skill or a professional skill. They're not interested in being teachers. If they could be a doctor, that's big money. Or if they could be a nurse, actually some nursing, x-ray technician, these are practical jobs that make good salaries. But being a pastor, a social worker, a teacher, forget about it. They're wanting jobs that bring this because that's where their safety and security, that's what's going to make them feel safe and secure and happy as money. Family even though it's 33% in their current life, their long-range sense of the importance of family is like 20%. That's way down the line from money. And spiritual, 8%, and look where health is. You know, all the interest that we have in health and healthy diets and all that stuff that's constantly on TV, or Michelle Obama's healthy eating program for kids in school. No way, baby. Give me my Fritos. Give me my Cheetos. Health is just not important to these guys at all.
That's surprising. You think maybe it's subliminal?
Well,
Or they're healthy.
When I think of, when I was in the age bracket of Generation Z, I'm not so sure I gave a rip about health either. You know, I never gave it a thought.
An awful lot of us wanted to play baseball, wanted to play football, wanted to play basketball, were active out swimming. It was a small group of nerds that really were not doing something physical.
But I don't think that your interest in sports necessarily was in order to become more healthy. In
No.
order to become
But
more
that's what
healthy.
this is talking about, healthy activity.
Yeah.
These kids would much rather sit home with a video game or their screens
Oh, really?
than go for a walk.
True.
Faith categories, just to get a feel for what's happening to our culture as a whole culture. This evangelicals continue to make up about they've shrunk a little from 7 to 6% of the total population. People who identify themselves as born again, and there are Catholics and Lutherans. Majority of Protestants would say that I experience life as, I've been saved by grace, and because of that grace, I'm born anew. Lutherans would say each day. So anybody who just says, yes, I feel like I've been born again because of Christ, that's gone from 33%. It went up during the Happy Clappy Jesus mega church model, and that's beginning to wane rapidly. It's now down 5% to 28%. Those who would be the mainline, all other mainline church groups would make up this vast majority: Catholics, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans who don't feel born again, all of the rest of that. That's gone down. But it's only gone down 4%, 5%, fairly stable. People who are dabbling with other religions, and because of the Asian population input, there's some growth here in other religions from 7 to 8%. But the most dramatic change in our whole culture is a change from people who are atheist, agnostic, or don't believe in God at all, going from 9% to 19% of all adults, and that's all adults.
That's in 20 years.
In 20 years, it's doubled. Generations. This slide, I apologize. The numbers are in yellow and beigey kind of a thing, and you just can't read them. Let me try to.
It's not bad.
Hmm?
Can you see it?
You can see a couple of them, but there are some numbers here that you just can't see. So let me find that page.
Oh, I see.
Way to
There
the
are
top
some.
numbers,
There are
top
some
numbers,
there.
I see.
And there are some numbers that you're just not seeing.
You could just point them out.
But I need my book to be able to read them. That's the problem. Here it is. The most significant numbers, the top number is Christian non-Catholic, which would include all Protestant groups. This bar is the Catholic group.
Pretty consistent.
Other faiths, the small group down here that are Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever. Agnostic, atheist, and none. The most dramatic change that has occurred is the combination of atheist, agnostic, and none among people 75 or above makes up about 20%, who are just really not involved in faith at all. 20%, 20%, 20%. It's actually a little higher in Gen X generation for some reason. It's more like 20, it's almost 30%. Back down here, but here it's 34%. 94% of these kids really either have no interest in believing in God, radically believe that God doesn't exist, or frankly don't want to talk about it, don't care about it, don't even want to think about it.
Or never been exposed to it, period.
Well, a lot of the rest of them haven't really been exposed to it, but they are already adamantly turned against even dialoguing about faith. And they had a different segment for this generation where they broke it out. Engaged Christians, that means 9% of those kids go to church weekly and are involved in the youth group and maybe do a service thing. Be an example of somebody like Cooper or Charlotte or some of our kids or Jacob, our kids that are actively involved. That's the engaged Christian. Church Christians would be the other 4 out of every 5 kids in a confirmation class that once they're confirmed get the heck out of Dodge.
But at least they've had exposure.
But they've
and
had some
They can
exposure.
come back.
And they do come back, and these kids, I will tell you, these kids have a positive experience of church. I did graveside service for Ron Anderson yesterday, and his granddaughter, who I didn't really even have in confirmation, I confirmed her because I walked in the door just as they were trying to confirm them. Trudeau, I'm blanking on which Trudeau it is, not Tyler, Taylor. We have a good relationship. All those kids, the Christie group, we have a good relationship. They're not churched at this point, because to be churched, you have to go more than 2 times a year. They're minimally involved, but they don't feel that this is a bad place. They're comfortable. That's not that they don't like me. They're just their priorities of work
We're
or
still searching, so if they've been exposed to it, they could
Yeah.
come back to it.
unchurched Christians make up about 14%. Other faith is consistent at that 7, but 34% have no religious affiliation and don't want any. One other change that we see in this generation, and the lost generation are the millennials, the 20 to 34-year-olds, because they radically fought to change the school system to lift and value women in education, and they built the educational programs in such a way that reinforced women's learning, but did not take into effect or awareness. They just didn't care about the value of the kinesthetic and the other ways that you need to teach for boys. The result is that in the 70s, 58% of the people in college were male to 42%. Today, 56% of students on all campuses are female. Women are going to school, men are not. And yesterday's release of a study on millennials tells us that the IQ of males in the 20 to 35 age group, they're not as smart as the generations ahead of them or behind them. They just have not developed and harnessed their mental capabilities and capacities. They're just not using their brains. And the next generation college is going to go anywhere. This is just a demographic study. All I want to show you in this is that when we interviewed elders, the vast majority of people that we interviewed were white. Culturally, the change is such that when we got to Gen Z, notice how many are Black, Hispanic, or Asian background, or even other backgrounds, Muslim, etc. They're in a world that is much more diverse. So here are the trends from section 1 of our material. These guys are screenagers, not teenagers. They're screenagers.
Spend their teenage years in front of the screen.
Yep. Their worldview is post-Christian. They do not experience a world in which those basic Christian or Judeo-Christian values that we talk about underlying our overall society, those aren't their values. They don't understand that's not their world. They do believe in safe spaces as normal. Safe spaces were developed for post-traumatic stress syndrome people to have places that they could go and not be challenged in a way that would set off their post-traumatic stress disability.
Trigger.
Safe places now mean I can have a place where nobody's going to challenge my thinking. I'm going to find a place, And in fact, colleges, which is the place you're supposed to go and have your brain challenged and think about new thoughts and expand, colleges are making safe space rules and trigger word rules. If you're going to talk about this, you have to warn me that you're going to talk about this topic because it might be offensive to me. My sexuality, I'm not sure about what it is, and I don't want to have anybody talking to me about sexuality. My sense of values, I'm not sure what I think about this or that topic, and I don't want anybody putting data out there that
How
might
can you
challenge
manage a
it.
place like that?
They
So-
just, I don't know, I wouldn't want to teach on a college campus today. Real safety for these kids is a myth. Remember, these are all kids that are post 9/11.
Sad.
They're all post 9/11 kids. This is one of the big shifts in our culture. No, there is no such thing as safe. The idea,
Well, you can understand that
Oh, exactly.
of all the violence that is happening in the malls and the theaters and, all the soft targets that are ripe for anybody that wants to create havoc.
and the fact that where the actual number per year of shootings is down over the last 20 years,
Yeah. It's the
And
mass shootings.
and is consistent with it's the number of people shot when they do the shooting. Even the total number shot
Right.
is not significantly more now than it was in the 60s. But we see every one of those, and it gets 24-hour 24-hour coverage, nonstop, replaying the videos, replaying the shootings. And we're not just stuck with what happens in Michigan or the UP now. We see what's going on in Paris or in Germany or in England, and when those tragedies hit, or South Africa, it doesn't matter, wherever it is in the world, we're going to see it 24 hours a day for a week.
Well, it was so unusual in the schools back, it wasn't groups of children.
Usually are safe in schools,
Yeah.
usually. Inner city schools, not true.
Yeah, not for bullying or anything, but from being shot to that, never going back.
The anxiety of it is greater. Guy in my brother's class broke up with his girlfriend and got up on the roof with his 30-06 and was going to shoot anybody coming to the high school he didn't like. That was 1961. So
Still rare though.
the reality is, but you never heard about that, but I can guarantee you today, if a guy got up on a roof at Moline High School, which had 2,700 students, and was shooting a rifle off, even if he only hit or wounded one person, that would be nonstop today.
Wall-to-wall news.
Yeah. So, but as far as they're concerned, real safety is a myth. The idea that I could go out, wander around at 11 o'clock at night as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, that my mom said, okay, tonight you guys can stay out until 10. We don't, we wanted to play hide and go seek in the dark or kick the can in the dark. No problem. But that reality is not there anymore. They are diverse, and their parents are double-minded. Their parents can't figure out whether they should train them up to be like they were in their world, or recognizing that the world is changing. How do I train this kid up to survive in this?
Or don't care.
Yeah, I don't know that's not what they mean by this, but
Right, I know.
yeah, but that may well be true.
Overprotective or underprotective.
Yeah, and they go back and forth between overprotective and underprotective. Plurality of Gen Zers, this is our next section. Plurality of Gen Zers consider personal achievement and hobbies the most important things to their sense of self. And that's a little bit more than the generation ahead of them, but hobbies, being a part of a mountain bike club, being a part of various kinds of groups where they do hobbies together. Achievement and hobbies are most important. Only 1/3 of teens believe that lying is wrong. As opposed to in your generation, if you're over the age of 75, 61% believe that lying is flat wrong all the time. There might be some times that they've learned over the years when your wife says, "Don't I look nice in this dress?" You know the correct answer, right?
Exactly.
Doesn't matter what truth is.
Yeah, maybe they just defined it a little differently than we did.
But-
They admit
But-
that white lies are lies.
But so we would fudge a little bit, but 31% said absolutely even that, you can't even get away with that kind of lie. These guys have been raised on Survivor TV shows. These guys have been raised on TV shows where lying, manipulating, not telling the whole truth, or intentionally lying to destroy somebody on your team so that you can get one up on in the process. That's what they've been raised with. So only a third of them even believe that lying is wrong. 1 in 8 describe their sexual orientation as something other than heterosexual. They're not sure, but they're searching. Those who identify as bisexual are about half of that. So these guys are struggling with what's their sexual identity. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. 7 out of 10 believe it's acceptable to be born of one gender and feel like another. 7 out of 10 of them
Wow.
can say, you can be born a male and feel like you're a female.
So that's a big percentage.
Yep.
Are
3 in-
they able to really perceive that at that age?
Well, we're going to talk about
Okay.
fluidity and what's going on, but remember, that's the world they live in, and we need to be able to be sensitive. If we're going to listen, we need to figure out how to be sensitive to this is the way they perceive reality. When I was a kid, even if you were gay, you probably hid it because
Definitely.
and struggled because you knew somebody was going to beat you up back behind the dumpsters on the way home from school. So these guys live in a world where what they're feeling, they're a little safer to feel those feelings,
It's true.
and they're struggling with that a little bit more. 2/3 want to finish their education. So 66% want to finish their education by the time they're 30, want to start a career by the time they're 30, and want to be financially independent by the time they're 30. Only 1 in 5 think they'll get married by the time they're 30.
Really?
Yep,
1 in 5.
yep. And that's slightly less than millennials. Millennials are not getting married. On average, it's like 28 for the group that are 20 to 35. So, where they're at now today is they're growing toward it, but their future goal is to have their life defined by finishing an education and starting a career. Their identity today is they're involved in 34% are at some level involved in church, confirmation, Sunday school. Their parents are trying to get them at least some basic spiritual education, but they don't anticipate by the time they're fully grown, future career and success are important. Only 16% have any thinking that their spiritual life will be a priority at all. Remember, 9% are engaged Christians, and there's another 7% who are kind of on the edge and say, yeah, probably that'll be somewhat important. I can see myself going to church when I get older. The rest of them, no. 84% no. Identity today, hobbies and pastimes. As success and career become important, even hobbies and pastimes are going to fall down a little bit on the chart. Identity today, because of that's the same as church, isn't it? 34%. Church and family are at 34% of how they function and live today in their daily life. They anticipate when they're on their own in their 20s, 30s, only 20% plan to get married by the age of 30, and so the other 4 out of 5 are going to be in an apartment somewhere with a roommate or living on their own, but it's going to be career centered. What's important to my sense of self? This is the order, and you'll notice that some other generations, elders have different sense of values than the kids. For elders, religion, religious beliefs, family, and family upbringing are very important. It's also, so you can see the lollipops. This is the priority, just having prioritized it. This is the priority. Professional and educational achievement, number 1. Hobbies, finding something they really enjoy doing. They envision themselves being on TV. There are now, on the internet, you can watch competitions like you and I watch baseball or football. These guys watch video game competitions and they can envision themselves being a big international video game rock star. Gender and sexuality, defining themselves in terms of who they are, from that perspective becomes the third highest group. Their friends become fourth highest group. Then comes family, religion, other issues like ethnicity, where I'm from, economic class or political affiliation go down for everybody at that point. I find it interesting, the millennials, politics is of highest interest, although it's way down the chart from other things, it's of higher interest for millennials than others. Now you know why they're marketing so much toward, that's the biggest generation, and they're getting interested in politics, and we'll see. Black, Hispanic, white, those values that we listed as the key ones in an African American community, identity with family and religion, and for in gender identity, it's not so much gay as it is males being really male, females being really female. But achievement, they're recognizing their racial group, their ethnic group as Black. These are all high priorities for them, because this has been part of the movement out of poverty and out of the lower class. As a pastor in a community in Chicago Heights, when I had an African American student finishing up high school, getting a scholarship and going to college, I was expected to give them the talk. And where I might say to a white kid, you know, it's great, you've achieved a lot in high school. I hope you go and experience a lot of things in college. Go to the football games, you know, try different classes, expand your way of thinking. Just enjoy this time in your life. With an African American student, I say, now you recognize that you really achieved a lot, and we really value that. But you have an opportunity here to help your whole community rise by your continuing to achieve. Your personal achievement is a reflection on all African Americans. Your personal achievement is a reflection on your faith in Jesus. Your personal achievement is a reflection on your family.
You're carrying all those obligations on your back.
And you're carrying all that stuff. And I had Black kids who really struggled with that burden. That's a heavy burden to bear. And it's because they never gave up. It's because they had good family and good faith and good church community that they got where they got, as opposed to the rest of the kids who've already fallen by the wayside. You know, these kids in Chicago Heights were going to school with kids where my white as well as Hispanic and Black kids in Chicago Heights, that was equally balanced. The girls wanted to get pregnant before they left high school. And they wanted to get pregnant to one of the guys who was seen in the community as kind of a rising star. And having that rising star's baby was a way of attaching your wagon, literally, to that rising star.
Did you have any qualms about having that talk, or at that time?
With my African American kids,
Yeah.
I screwed it up the first time, and Leonard, the dad, called me up and said, "What the heck did you say, my boy? He's going to Howard University. He's got to achieve when he gets to Howard University." And
So you had told him to have fun?
I told him to have fun, and he went and got a girl pregnant.
Howard University?
Yeah, he went to Howard. It was good school, good kid, and I still feel bad about that to this day. I did not understand the impact of the importance of that talk within an African American community. My blank is very important to my sense of self. For active, engaged Christians love faith, family, even where they're from in the world. I guess that's a bunch of Southern Baptists who are proud about being from the South. I don't know. But they also, in terms of personal achievement and even hobbies and identity of who they are sexually, these things, which for these kids is predominantly dating, we'll find out. But these things, they're higher than all the rest of the kids. That, again, being an engaged Christian has the same kind of impact almost as being from an African American family group. Your faith, family become very important, and so become a reflection of your achievement.
I'm having a little difficulty with that
Which part of it?
one.
Oh, this is all other kids 20 or 19 and under versus the kids who are actively going to church.
Oh,
The
okay.
tan ones are church kids, the other ones is just lumping them all together. Now we're going to talk about gender a little bit. Engaged Christians, clearly, 74%, I think that works out, believe that you are the sex you were born. 74% of those 9% that are engaged Christians.
That you're the what?
That you are, if you're born a boy, your DNA is
Oh,
male.
okay.
You're an XY, you're an XY. There's no debate about it. And you need to deal with your feelings that are inappropriately aimed. You just got to figure out how to sublimate them or do something with them, because that's wrong. For those engaged Christians who are young, they're not going to talk much about that. That's not Lutheran. That would be more your evangelical focus. But your most engaged Christian kids tend to be either evangelical or Catholic. Lutheran kids that are engaged, and we have some good ones here, are going to have a different. They're going to be more over there. Even among evangelicals, 19% say a person's gender is what they feel like. They don't pretty much think about the way the society feels, but there's very few that are unsure. You're either this or a small perspective feel this. Among the whole, lumping all 19-year-olds and under together, the sex a person was born still is like 46% feel that you are what you were born.
It's innate, is that?
Yeah, no, they're saying you are what you're born. If you're born a boy, you're a boy. 40, just short of half, 46%.
Really? Okay.
33% is what a person feels like. A person's desire or sexual attraction determines that. They've got a large number, 6 there. They don't care, either way, they don't care how society views you. But look at the number of percentage here, 12% are in an unsure. What this tells us is that over half, 54% of these kids are in a fluid mode. And when we talk about sexuality with our kids under 19 and under, they like to use the word that sexually they see this as a fluid time. They're not sure.
I can see that.
They may not decide whether they're gay or straight until they're well into their 20s. They're just not. They're not gonna let that be an issue. They're not necessarily dating. Remember, these kids, most of them don't care if they have a driver's license or not. Most of them don't care if they're dating or not. They're hanging out with their same sex and multiple and other sex friends. They hang out in groups. Dating in the traditional sense of dating is not the majority. It's for this 46%. These are the normal date, go to prom kids, but for the rest of them, not so much.
And they're not so interested in driving either. That
No.
surprises me. Wow.
No, they're not those things that we identify often. They're just not a big deal for them. The idea of getting a job when Tim was in high school, the vast majority of those kids wanted a job so they could afford the insurance and a car so that they could drive. These guys, not so much. Is it acceptable for a person to be born one gender and feel like another? Definitely and probably are these blue colors. For all of Gen Z, 67% say, 69% say it's acceptable or probably acceptable for a person to be born one gender and feel like another. Conservative Christians, that drops to about 42%. It's less for those kids, 44%. And the definitely not is a stronger 29 versus 12. The vast majority of the kids in this generation, between not sure and probably definitely not, it's like 80% of them. They're just kind of, we're not sure about all of this. It's okay. We're going to let you explore what you're feeling now.
The engaged Christians, does that include all other?
This is the 9% that are active Christians.
of the
Of the total lump of kids
Okay,
in
Generation
Gen Z.
Z, we're still talking
Yeah.
all of okay.
This is all of Gen Z. This is just the
Okay.
9 out of 11, the 1 out of 11 that are actively probably evangelical or Catholic Christian. But even in that group, a fair number think it might be acceptable. 44% think it might be acceptable for somebody to feel like they're different than the gender they were born. That's pretty significant. It's okay for somebody to change their body to become another gender. We're talking gender surgery now, body part reassignment and all that kind of stuff. Engaged Christians, definitely not 47%, probably not another 16%. So the majority of this group is saying, no, you got to deal with your body the way it came out. Within this group, the significant numbers are 17% are unsure, 18% not a lot, definitely 24% probably, and then again not a huge number, but about 35, more than a third, 41% say definitely not, but the not sure, definitely not, probably not. I focus on the probably not and not sure group. Make up 35%. They're gonna kind of let things be and figure it out. They're living in a culture where sexual identity and gender identity is dramatically in flux on the movies, in the videos, in what their teachers are teaching them at school. These kids are getting a little bit more of, if you got an XY gene or an XY critter, they're getting a lot, the conservative kids, particularly Catholic and evangelical, are getting that more at church. This is my favorite slide of the bunch. Gender's talked about too much. The Gen Z kids think that we just talk about this way too much. Let us kind of just be and figure this out over time. Don't get so wound up about it. Among their peers, they don't talk about it so much. Just about right, 40%. Not enough or not sure is huge among peers. We just don't talk about it that much. I'm not sure if we talk about it too much. They're not upset about it. But in terms of the culture, they feel like the culture's constantly.
Except the adults have to decide how they're gonna live with others that have already reached their
Right.
destination. Yeah.
Right.
So it's more important they talk about it.
Yeah. But the adults, they're feeling like they're being preached at, is what that subtly says. A few of them feel like we need to talk about it more, but by and large, they just don't want to hear anything more about it. Most of my friends do not share my beliefs. This is sort of like that slide of the post-truth thing. 25%, 35% feel like their friends do share their belief. 35% feel like their friends do kind of, we think about things, we see the world the same way. 34% don't know. And then about another 31% agree that their friends don't get them. So that could be your kids who are, this is relating to gender. So 31% are really questioning and in flux and are afraid to know whether their friends, only about a third of them feel like their friends can talk about it and their friends get it. Now here's the financial part. I have clear goals of where I want to be in 5 years. 72% of kids under the age of 19 are pretty clear where they want to be in 5 years. That's way more than the millennials, and way more than the Gen Xers. They weren't quite clear. They were going to just kind of take life as it came. They weren't sure. This generation, standing between me and my slide, this generation think a little differently about that. And you can see the between engaged Christians and people with no faith. You can see faith and family, faith is really important for the kids as you get farther away from faith. Friends become more important, parents less so. Money is equally important to all of them, but active Christians significantly less. The people who have no faith, money becomes even more important. Personal interest and self-definition through hobbies and personal interest, higher, lower for Christians. Faith becomes important only for those who are actively engaged. This just compares the 20 to 35-year-olds on this side with the under 20s on this side. Highest priorities again: finish my education, start a career, become financially independent, and then follow my dreams. Enjoy life before you have responsibilities is at 38%. And then self-exploration, who am I, comes in at 31%. What I find interesting is find out who you really are for the kids who are 20 to 35. So these are the kids of the hippie parents, the baby boomers. Find out who you are. Is becoming financially independent is pretty important. Finishing education, but look at how much less. 66 versus 52. Start a career, which was number 2 for these guys, becomes number 3. But find out who you really are becomes their next highest one. And then following my dreams becomes the next highest one. And they're interested in spiritual maturity, where these guys, they're twice as interested in spiritual reality. 28% want to be married by age 30. Only 20% here anticipate being married by age 20. So you can see there, these guys are much more focused on the dollar sign. Primary marks of adulthood, when they did focus groups and studies: financial independence for Gen Z, financial independence, most important image of adulthood. Emotional maturity, much less so. Being legally an adult, a little bit less. Whereas the kids who are 20 to 35, financial independence was, I can live in my mom and dad's basement a little bit longer until I figure out what I want to do. But emotional maturity is their highest priority. Self-exploration, maturity, identity. So you see a difference between these two generations. It's not like a slow trend in some ways. They're very different than the generation immediately ahead of me. That's why when that one video I would have showed you about the test where the millennials, they don't have a clue what these guys are thinking. Here we can see some just slowly decaying trends. Lying is morally wrong, from 61 down to 34 by each 20-year age group. I find this one interesting. Even if it were legal, Christians should not use marijuana recreationally. Those over 75 say absolutely not. Everybody under 75. 25% think that might be wrong. 20% on average. 23, 22, 19, 21. So there's a cultural difference between the folks over 75. Abortion is wrong. I find it fascinating that the Gen Xers, which was the first generation dramatically impacted by, the generation most dramatically impacted by Roe versus Wade, they think abortion is wrong in a higher level than baby boomers. And that's because, as my son who's 34, right on that, he's a millennial, but he's only a couple years younger than the Xers. The Xers were the first generation to be told by their mother, I wish I had an abortion instead of you. And that was not an uncommon thing. So these guys are kind of more pro-life than even the kids younger than them. But abortion is decaying in terms of its wrongness. Marriage should be a lifelong commitment between a man and a woman. Over 75, 66%, and then it slowly begins to go down from there. Sex before marriage is morally wrong. Isn't it interesting that the only generation that thinks sex before marriage is morally wrong, the group that feels most strongly about that are those Generation Xers that were part of that sexual revolution when they were kids. Homosexual behavior is morally wrong. Has gone from 41% over the age of 75 down to 20%. So there's still 20% of kids who think that homosexual behavior is wrong.
You think maybe that one sex before marriage was because AIDS came into prominence about that time?
Oh, that's a good point. That is when AIDS came in. And interestingly enough, even though sex before marriage is not wrong, these kids are doing very little of it. They're more interested in their video games and their hobbies than they are in sex and dating. And that could be because it's just been dampened out of the system. They're a little afraid to mess with that stuff. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, maybe the more creative interests you have, the less your mind is occupied with your
Right.
sexuality.
Yeah. Belief about moral by faith segment, you can see that the active, engaged Christians feel far more strongly about all these behaviors. And as you go down to the group that have no faith, they feel they have very few problems with lying is morally wrong, 20%. For people who have no faith, it's just not a big issue.
Any behaviors at all.
Yeah, and that's the agnostics, atheists, that's the 34%. 34% of the kids you're working with in this age think marijuana is fine, think lying is fine, think abortion is fine, think anybody, marriage is, they don't even really care about marriage, but for those who would think about it, it could be between anybody. Sex before marriage is morally wrong, and homosexual behavior is wrong, is down in the single digits. So if you're agnostic, atheist, or a nun, you just don't want to think about religion.
Okay.
Moral values are non-existent.
This is an age group.
This is only in the Z's. This is all under 20.
All of the Z's. Still in
This
the
is
Z's.
all the kids under 20. I'm not going to talk about this segment so much, except to say that I think I'm going to end right here. There are a bunch of slides that have some interest, but basically these kids are as interested faith-wise. The biggest issue or barrier that they find is the barrier of evil. And this is the story of Job. Either Job, who did everything to be right before God, was righteous, and God was a righteous and just God, or God was not all good. God could be evil sometimes, because if Job followed all the rules and he was being punished or feeling ill, if God is all just, then God can't be good. If God is good, then God is not just because he's suffering. So these kids struggle with the sense of, and of course the answer to Job is God reaching out and saying, it's not about that. It's about the fact that this world is the way I made this world and gave it its complexity and its freedom and its interrelationship, and I'm calling you to a personal relationship where you can walk with me, or I can walk with you in relationship, and I'll walk with you through all of this stuff. It's not about, if I'm a good God and a just God, you'll never have anything bad happen to you. That's not what it's about. You're framing the question wrong. is what God says to Job. And Job's friends are saying, well, God is good and God is just, so you must have sinned, Job. And Job says, no, I've lived nothing but a righteous life my whole life. Why is God testing me? Why is God? And so Job deals with the problem of human suffering, and that's what these guys struggle with. If there's a good God, if God is love and God is a good God,
He wouldn't let bad things
He
happen.
would not let bad things happen. The other thing that we find in this is kids, where my generation had very little trouble seeing science and faith being able to be complementary. These guys, you're either science or faith, and very little in the middle where there's, so only 1 in 4 think that it can be complementary, whereas baby boomers were 45%, Gen Xers 36, and you guys were even more. 4 out of 5 church-going teenagers say church is relevant for them. So here are some pluses. If we got kids coming, they're finding something here. 3 out of 5 Christians think it's important to, who don't think church is important, say they find God elsewhere, but the other 2 don't. So that's only within the Christians. So of the 66% who identify themselves as not being agnostic, atheist, or whatever, a few of them look for God in nature, but not as many. The church is a positive place, and 1 out of 5 teens chooses a negative judgmental image of church. So that's the part of that atheist, agnostic, not all of them, but 21% of them would identify church as judgment, and their media. You watch The Simpsons, you watch South Park, Simpsons, any of the TV shows, any of the Marvel comic stories, all of them subtly say religion and faith are just really a bunch of, they're programmed by their culture, the world, the TV shows, the things they watch, their music, to say church is just not relevant. It's really fighting upstream. But for the kids who get here, they find it valuable. Some of the other things that are interesting down the slides about faith is that for kids, and this would be your highly active kids, like we have 3 or 4 of, and this is your nominally active kids that I see 3 or 4 or 5 times a year. Church is a place to find answers to live a meaningful life. Vast majority, yes. I feel like I can be myself at church. Vast majority say yes. They're not away from here because they don't feel comfortable. Church is relevant for my life. Yeah, they do feel that. People at church are tolerant of those with different beliefs. Yeah, for the most part, they feel that.
These are the ones that go to church?
These are the ones that go to church.
Okay.
So there is a segment where we've got a good connection point. But even among the church-going kids, they think that the church doesn't really address the church science thing very well. They think the church is a bit overprotective of their teenagers, and they're watching for hypocrisy, particularly in the nominal church-going kids. They perceive hypocrisy. And they struggle with the church as being a safe place to express doubt. But there's your, for non-Christians, barriers to faith. Their primary thing is not that they've had a bad experience with church, they've just had no experience with church. It's not that they used to go to church but just don't go anymore. That's in the small 12%. It's not that there are too many injustices in the history. They're not analyzing it that way. That's the old guys, the 75 and older, or the 55 and older. They're the ones who are saying, well, Christianity's set up. There have been some bad things that have happened in history. I believe science refutes too much of the Bible. 20%, that's having a little more impact. Watching Christians' behavior. Christians are hypocrites. That's even more dramatic in my son's case. But I have trouble believing in a good God would allow so much suffering. We've got to address the issue of a God who walks with us in the midst of a difficult world. And as Lutherans, I think that's right up our alley. Here's the statistics about science and the Bible are in conflict, and I'm on the side of science. Science and the Bible are in conflict. I'm on the side of the Bible, and independent or complementary. See, my generation, 45% say, hey, that you can have faith and still be involved in science. And from there on, I would say Bible relevance. This is the slide that bothers me the most. Which image best represents the church? I think most of your Lutheran Catholic kids pick the cross because there's no sacramental image here. For those kids, a sense of the presence of Jesus in sacrament. Their image of worship over there is people waving their hands in the air in a praise service. If that's your idea of church, the vast majority of millennials saying that. They don't want. They see the church as judgmental, as a negative image, or they see it as a comfort in the cross. Only 2% think of church as relating to nature and the openness of the world, or 7% think of the church in terms of service. That's 7. That one there is somebody serving in a soup kitchen. But what they tried to do, their idea of a traditional church was this pulpit thing. But I don't think our kids don't think that way. And I think that's about all I really want to go after. Here's this slide. They screwed it up some, but Gen Z kids are more interested in church as a possible community. That's their highest value. They're not so interested in it being quiet or meditative. They like it loud a little bit more. They like performance. They like it to be a good performance. They like it to be relaxed rather than formal. But they like traditional as much or more than modern. That's not really the issue. Or even flexible is not the issue.
So we're going to talk about what works, what case studies you had.
What we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about case studies. So why don't we wrap up at this point if you guys are comfy doing that?
Weren't we going to get those to read ahead of time?
And I'm going to give those to you right now. Yeah.
Cool.
4 out of 5 engaged Christians say I can share my thoughts with my parents. The last section has to do with family. 4 out of 5 kids feel they can, who are engaged Christians feel they can talk to their parents. 2 out of 5 engaged Christians feel that their parents really haven't talked to them about things like screen usage and media and pornography and all the things that come on the screens. Youth pastors get frustrated that technology and moral relativism are the defining things they experience with the kids. And 2/3 of youth pastors say their biggest struggle is with parents who don't prioritize their teen spiritual growth. So of the people who actually are working with kids, it has more to do with the parents who are busy taking their kids to traveling teams and never bringing them to church and not trying to support their participation in the life of the church. And that's across all denominations, and I experienced that too. The biggest frustration being that the parents are not on board with it. And it has an effect on stewardship. Parents who are giving less to the church because they're spending $2,000 and $3,000 a year on hotel rooms and travel to chase their kids around to these weekend hockey matches, basketball games, volleyball games, baseball games. But overall, you'd be surprised as to how affirming, other than the agnostic group, how much people believe Jesus was a real person. Jesus was really crucified. Jesus was the Son of God. These things are the sense of inerrant and infallible, one thing I think we as Lutherans have that's a plus is the idea of the Bible being an inerrant and infallible absolute source of authority that was spoken by God directly to us is on the wane. These kids would much rather hear about a Bible that was written by human beings who are experiencing the love of God and are trying to communicate that to them, because that says if the one of the rubs they have is the very rub we talked about last week, and that is if Jesus was God emptying himself and coming down to earth to be like us and among us and relate to us on a person-to-person level and show the power of his healing love, causing us to connect with each other and be sources of healing for one another, if that was that personal, why would the book that tells the story about it be more spiritual than Jesus was? Be more removed, more perfect, more inerrant, and more infallible than Jesus the person was. It's more consistent. We have a window there with the idea that they're more comfortable with the idea of a scripture that is written by men who experience the presence of God and want to tell me about their experience with God. Because if they had a relationship with God, what might I have? I might have a relationship with God. And that their human relationship with a God who was a real and human, not a mystical ghost in a white nightie, but a real human being who came and put his hands in people's hands and put his hands on people's heads and touched them and cared for them. So we have a real plus there to deal with. And I think that's enough, huh? There's a whole lot of stuff about family there that